Rev up the savings at JCPenney's Power Penny Days. Starting Wednesday, wrap up huge deals like Home Expressions Quick Dry Bath Towels, only $5. Stock up on fresh lineups of tees and tanks. Women's styles start at $9, and kids' thereabouts tees start at $7. Plus, bring home extra bling. Yes, please, lab-created gemstones, only $13 while they last. JCPenney, make everybody count. Offers valid on select styles 410 to 414. Power Penny deals excluded from coupons. Other exclusions apply. See store or jcp.com for details.
Hi everyone, I'm Deb Flashenberg. Welcome to Yoga, Birth, Babies, a podcast produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. We will be diving into everything prenatal yoga, birth, and baby related, hoping to inspire, educate, and empower you through your journey into motherhood. Thank you for listening. Hi, I'm Deb Flashenberg. I'm your host of Yoga Birth Babies, and today we're going to talk about parenting proactively, not reactively, from newborn through toddler and older. And what does that mean? It means not jumping to, oh, this is a consequence, or, oh, here's a punishment, but instead proactively helping with the behavior that we ultimately want instead of reacting to the behavior. And I have to tell you, I loved this conversation. I spoke with Dr. Heather Maguire. She has spent over a decade studying behavior and working with children, parents, and educators. She's the proud mama of 2 kids and a professor teaching school psychology courses, and the founder of Prism Behavior, which helps parents manage challenging behaviors with confidence. It was such a great conversation. She gave tips and ideas and perspectives from newborn up to grade school. She and I have some common situations with our kids, so it was really a fun conversation. I think you're very much going to enjoy that. Before we get to that, I want to let you know about a free downloadable we have on our website, 5 simple solutions to the most common pregnancy pains. So if you go to our website, sign up, you will get that, because a lot of people have pains and aches during pregnancy, and I've got some easy solutions for those. Why walk around with an achy back, achy neck, achy hips? I got you covered on that. So check that out on our website, prenatalyogacenter.com. Also, a reminder that we have prenatal classes, live classes, 7 days a week. And I know that you and the community listen to the podcast are showing up for the classes because people say, hey, I heard about you on the podcast. So it's so great when you pop in and you let me know that you learned about this from the podcast. And we've got Baby and Me and postnatal classes and our workshops. So we got you covered on that end. I also want to thank everyone that has left a rating and review. Our reviews have really popped up there. So thank you for spending your time doing that. It helps people find the podcast. And if you haven't had the chance to do that, please take a moment, jump over to wherever you listen to this from and leave a rating and review. And then the last thing I want to let you guys know about is we got the go ahead to continue our teacher training. It's this huge 85-hour teacher training. Oh, it is so in depth. I'm so very proud of this. We got the go ahead to continue with our online program through 2021. After that, we're probably going to be back in person. So if you've been eyeing it, you've been thinking about it, and you're thinking, oh, when it's in person, I have to travel to New York twice. We do it over 2 long weekends. For at least 2 more sessions, we are going to be online. So check that out. Of course, follow us on Instagram and all the good stuff. All right, that's enough of me chatting and rambling on. Let's take a super quick break, and we come back. Please enjoy my conversation with Heather.
Swimsuit? Check. Sunscreen? Check. Phone charger? Check. Don't forget to pack the 5-Hour Energy. It fits great in a pocket or carry-on, and the alert feeling will help you arrive ready for anything. Now get 20% off when you use code 5HETRAVEL at 5hourenergy.com. Expires April 30th. One-time use only. Not valid with other discounts. Remember, visit 5hourenergy.com and use code 5HETRAVEL to save 20%.
Hi, Heather. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for having me on the show today.
I am really, really excited to speak with you. I love what you focus on about kids with ADHD. I love that you give parents tactics and help, and not just your neurotypical kid, but like the whole gamut. So I'm just so excited to jump into this conversation. I feel like this topic of supporting people through infancy and toddlerhood, it's talked about, but I really like how you approach it. So thank you.
Well, I'm excited to be here. And yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm sure we'll get into my background, but, initially I worked with kids who, I spent most of my time working with kids with disabilities, but, having my own kids, it's just become so apparent to me, with my own kids, and then also with, my friends and their kids, that, everybody needs these sorts of strategies. And I relied so much on my clinical background that I wanted to kind of bring it to everyone, whether kids are typically developing or if they had, any sort of like mild to moderate disability. Like that's my jam.
I know, I can tell from what I've done a little deep dive into your podcast, into your website. So I'm really excited. So I guess let's jump into, if you can just tell people a little bit about yourself, what led you to starting Prism Behavior and working with kids.
Perfect. Well, I'm Heather Maguire. I have, first off, 2 kids. So my kids are Landon, and he's 10, and Addie, and she is 7. And like you mentioned, I do focus a little bit on kids with ADHD because my son Landon, he actually does have ADHD. But in terms of my background, and I've been married to my husband for 15 years. Don't want to forget about him. We met in college and got married, and we've been married ever since. But in terms of my background professionally, so I have a doctorate in educational psychology, and then I am what's called a board certified behavior analyst, which sounds really fancy, but kind of, the background is, I spent a lot of time working with kids with disabilities, specifically with autism. And, oftentimes kids with autism struggle with things like communication and also some, problematic behaviors, sometimes pretty intense problematic behaviors. So that was my background. And so in terms of, professionally as well, I'm a professor. I teach grad school. I teach school psychology and school counseling. But like I kind of mentioned in, a few moments ago, as I, became a parent, so I became a behavior analyst and, I finished my doctorate program before parenting. But as I became a parent, I realized that really all parents could benefit from these sorts of strategies, like the similar strategies that I would use with kids, who had more significant disabilities. But just kind of, looking at those strategies in a slightly different way can help all parents. And so that's kind of like my focus. It's the practical, right? And so, that's a little bit about me and my background.
I think the practical strategies are so, so important. I'm excited to get into it. I know you talk a lot about the reward system, which I've tried. I struggle, but I try. I've tried.
We should talk about that a little bit more specifically. The clinician in me is like, and maybe we can problem solve with that a little bit later if we have time.
Yeah, no, I'm excited because you and I have a lot of parallels. My daughter just turned 7 2 days ago, and I have a 9-year-old also with ADHD. So I feel like I can
There you go.
Yeah, I can learn a lot from you. And it's so interesting also having one child with something neuroatypical and one without. It's just in the way you parent, the way that I parent them, I try to be equal, but it definitely, things are not always the same because they have different needs.
Totally. And you have to be very sensitive. One of the things I'm always concerned about with my son is like, he struggles with his behavior more than my daughter does. Mm-hmm. And so he's to the age where he's aware of that, right? So he can see she's younger than me and she doesn't have her struggles, look different than mine. And so we have to have conversations about that because it's not, you start to see sometimes with kids, with ADHD and learning disabilities, they start to have this like negative view of themselves. Mm. And, as parents, we have to be really aware of that. And, sometimes it's hard. It's harder sometimes. And if I'm completely honest, sometimes it's harder to parent him. And I have to just be so careful because obviously I love my kids both equally, and he is a great kid and so is she. So I don't want him to kind of, think like, wow, look at my sister and look at me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I see it. I absolutely do see it with my own kids. So I'm excited. We'll get into that, but I want to make sure that we talk about some of that transitional stuff from like newborn to toddlerhood, because that's a lot of what my community, we have some in the community that have older kids. But I think a lot of them are listening with younger kids or some even pregnant. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your own experience with the transition from pregnancy to parenthood. There's so many transitions in there, identity loss, new boundaries in your relationship. It's just such a huge time of transformation. Do you mind sharing a little bit about your journey?
Sure. So I think definitely when you become a parent, a mother, everything changes. And the reality is it changes even beforehand. Like I just remember when I was pregnant and, I had just gotten over morning sickness. I was like in the second trimester and, I was like, oh, I don't feel sick. I can eat something that I've, besides like the crackers I've been chewing on for the last, 3 months. And I was like, oh, you know what? I'll make a sandwich. Right. And then I realized to myself, I'm like, well, wait a minute. Am I allowed to have deli meat? What about this? So all of a sudden, whereas before, like if I tell the story in its whole, I just was like, you know what? I'm not going to worry so much about deli meat. I'm just going to eat the sandwich. That was the decision I made for me. But it's just scary sometimes to look on the internet, like, and what am I doing wrong as a parent, even before my kids were born, right? So I think the transition of like, what I do, it impacts more than me. Right. And I mean, that happens too when you get married, right? And, what I do impacts my partner. But even more so, like, when I'm pregnant, what I put in my body impacts my baby. And then afterwards, all the decisions I make, pretty much on a day-to-day basis have some impact on my kids. And so you're right. Like there is some sort of identity loss in a way of like, it's not just me. I have to think and put my focus on this other individual without losing myself in the process. Right. And I mean, I think like, at least if I think back on my own personal experience, I didn't, have like, I was fortunate enough, I didn't have postpartum depression or anything like that, but I did struggle in those initial years with like a sense of mom guilt for sure. Of like, what am I doing right? And what am I doing wrong? And why don't I have enough time to work out and all of these things? And I think especially if I were to give, some of those young parents out there some hope, just in those early years, it is, definitely as a parent, you give yourself, I think, throughout the whole journey, but it is very, very intense in the beginning, the amount that child needs you. And so, one of the things as I look back, I'm like, some of that stuff was a season. Even though working out, for example, is something that is very important to me, there were periods of time that I just, decided to put that on the shelf for a little while and focus on my kids and try not to feel guilty about that. Right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I was successful and sometimes I wasn't. But definitely I hear what you're saying in terms of the challenges, in terms of, transitioning from the pregnancy and having young kids. Right.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, that transition was much harder. I think one of the things I was most surprised at is it was a lack of personal space and then just a lack of getting things done. Like I remember just trying to go get a bagel. Instead of just slipping my shoes on and walking out the door, it was now like a half an hour event.
Yes.
And it just felt in that autonomy, I was lost. Like the agency over my own body and time was lost. And that was really hard. And I still struggle with that almost 10 years later.
Yes. But it's just a different game when like you're like, okay, to get out the door. Okay. I'm breastfeeding about every 2 to 3 hours. Okay. So it takes me about a half hour to do that. And then like when I would count back the time, and then I was working pretty soon after I had my kids. So I would like count back the time. And I'm like, how does it take, 3 hours to get out the door? But here I am getting up at whatever time to make this happen. And you're like, how versus my prior life, I would just get up and go.
Yeah, that was definitely a challenge. I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the ways of parenting that's different.
Yeah.
So the way in which someone parents an infant is going to be different than how someone parents a toddler and then a younger child. And then, and I know they're going to require different skill sets and boundaries and rewards. So can you start to give some tips to how to navigate these different stages and expectations of behaviors? Because we can't expect a toddler to behave like a 5-year-old or a 5-year-old to behave like a 10-year-old. So I'm just going to throw that whole massive question.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I'll probably try to like simplify it, and then we can dive down, deeper in certain areas if you want. But like when you have a young baby, really, and then, up through the first year, obviously cognitively, they're not realizing there's a difference between right and wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think, at the same time, some problematic behaviors can start to come out, like biting and pinching and things like that, right? So I think for really young kids, the best form of like, how do you manage, some of those behaviors that can come out? Because it's pretty common. Kids realize, like little kids even realize that I can pull your hair and you react, right? Mm-hmm. The best thing to do with the really little ones is just to kind of more ignore and redirect their behavior, right? So, rather than just being like, no, don't do that. If they're like hair pullers, for example, you kind of try to, as if you have longer hair as a mom, you pull your hair back. And if they try to pull your hair, you stop them from doing that without overreacting, and then try to get them involved in another activity. But I mean, obviously that's usually, it can be, still be frustrating that sometimes these, these behaviors start to come out, and they can be frustrating, but that's usually our best line of defense with like little kids. Redirecting it is. And then when kids are more like the toddler age, we still do a lot of that. And to be honest, if redirection works, I would kind of, use that. You always want to use kind of what I would say is like the least restrictive or intrusive thing as possible. So if you're able to redirect and it works, then go ahead and use that. But then around the toddler age, if needed, I don't think that it's wrong to start using some sort of like timeout system, as for discipline. So I know some positive behavior people out there are like, no discipline, only rewards and all of that. And I kind of use a more balanced approach, I would say. So it is okay. I think where the difficulty comes in is like understanding how to implement a timeout effectively, and then also understanding if you are over relying on discipline procedures like timeout, right? And so for the really little kids, like more is not better, right? Short timeouts are good. Like 1 minute is usually sufficient. There's no shame involved. It's just like, if you think about a timeout should just be kind of a quick and brief removal from what's called like the time in or the preferred environment, right? And so, it could be sitting on a chair, or it could be just like, hey, if you're going to do that while you're watching a show, I'm going to pause your show for a minute, And so that would be like a timeout method. I think again, though, where it becomes problematic is the over reliance on that. If you find that you're having to use timeout a lot with your kids, it's probably because you're over relying on what I would say is the reactive, right? And so a timeout is an example of being reactive, versus rewards, which we'll talk about later, is an example of being proactive, right? So there's lots of different things we can do to prevent challenging behavior. And that should kind of be, I would say like our emphasis, right? And then as kids get older, you could still use timeout. To be honest, I still use timeout sometimes with my 10-year-old. And again, it's not a long timeout. It doesn't have to, but it can be short, and it kind of creates a break in the situation. It gives him a break and me a break, right? But then, it allows us then to have a discussion afterwards, right? Or like a small loss of privilege. So that's kind of like the hierarchy of on the reactive side. And then of course, my emphasis is always going to be on the proactive side, which I hopefully will spend a lot of time talking about today.
So yeah, I would definitely want to get to the proactive and reactive. So I want to go back to the idea of the timeout, because I feel like I have heard So many different perspectives. And I like that you're saying it's still a valid choice to use, because sometimes you do need to remove them from the situation of what's going on to de-escalate things. So when you're saying not over-relying, can you expand on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think so reactive strategies are for timeout, are for the infrequent situations when our proactive strategies aren't effective. No matter what we do, our kids are going to act out from time to time, and we have to know how to deal with the times they react or they act out. Right. And so that, I would say, and you can't come up with a specific number, right? Mm-hmm. But most of the time, and I would say with toddlers, if you're using timeout multiple times a day and you're getting into back and forth arguments and things like that, probably that's an indicator that it's not ineffective. Something can be adjusted that would be more effective in your home.
Okay. And then you were talking about kind of that balance of reward and consequence.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of pulling this through my own experience. We have a reward system, but we also have consequences. So if rules are broken or things aren't done, there's consequences. And part of that consequence is they don't get their reward. And then sometimes part of that consequence would be, again, my kids are a little older than toddlers. So it would be they don't get to watch after dinner. So what is that? If there is a possible balance, how does one find that balance of consequence and rewards?
Totally. So just so we're clear too, all of life has consequences, right? And so I know we use the word consequence a lot of times, in a more the consequence is the bad thing that happens. But after our kid, engages in certain behavior, either we do things to reward them because we want to see more of that behavior, or we do things to punish or to discipline them because we want to see less of that behavior, right?
And I feel consequence is a nice way of saying punishment.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, one of the things I find, as a clinician is punishment and discipline have become bad words. And I get where where the professionals are coming from, because there is an over reliance on them. A lot of times, a lot of parents still rely a lot on spanking, and spanking, there's a lot of research to show that it's not very effective, but also it can lead to, more negative outcomes for kids and whatnot. Right. And so I get where those clinicians are coming from, but a lot of times what they're saying is a quiet corner is actually a timeout. They just don't like the word timeout, which is what I find funny as a behavior analyst. I look at things in a very specific light. And so people might package something in a nice bow and call it something else. And I'm well, that's still a timeout.
Right. So
that's just doing the timeout the right way.
That's, I feel consequences. It's there's going to be a consequence, but we don't want to use, we're just kind of tie a pretty bow instead of saying punishment. But it's, like you said, every action's going to have either a reward or consequence. That's what we're trying to also teach our kids. Yes, you're going to get a reward, or by choosing this action, there's a consequence to your choice.
Yes. So let me kind of flip things in two separate ways for you. Okay. So let's say, your kiddo needs to clean their room. Okay. And then they can go play with their friends. Right. And then maybe for cleaning their room, they get a sticker on their chart to earn something as well. Mm-hmm. One way to frame it is a first and a then. So, however long it takes you, first you need to clean your room, then you can go play with your friends, right? Or you could frame it, if you don't clean your room, you can't play with your friends. You're not, so it sounds funny, but it's all kind of in the delivery as well, mm-hmm. of how we as parents, how we frame things, right? So really playing with the friends in this situation actually is a reward, right? So is the sticker, but playing with the friends is the reward, right? But we don't want to package it as a punishment of you can't do this if you don't do this, right? Versus do this and then you can do this. So, because if we start with that attitude, then we kind of set the stage for kind of, an argument, so to speak. And another thing you can do, so here's one of the things I did with my son. We use reward systems as well, and we use in the past, we've used like a quarter-based reward system. Okay. And, when we started using it with my son, it was a few years back, before COVID and distance learning and all of that, when, for him, like normal school is going on and normal homework was going on. Okay. And so he would come home and he hated to do homework. Okay. So I set up a reward system where, once he finished his homework, no matter what, he earned a quarter. But if he was able to do his homework without complaining, or arguing or having a meltdown, he earned 2 quarters. So there's actually like 2 contingencies there. So no matter what, if he does it, he gets that reward. Okay. But if he's able to do it without having a meltdown, he gets a better reward, right? Versus the other situation could be like, you earn a quarter if you do your homework, but if you, complain or argue, then you're grounded. I mean, you don't get your quarter. Yeah. You don't get your quarter and you're in trouble, or you just don't get your quarter or whatever. So again, I think one of the best things we can do it's how we spin it and our attitude about it too. Cause sometimes it's just, parenting is not easy. It's hard to have this like rosy attitude all the time as parents. It's not going to happen. You're going to have to forgive yourself for the moments that it doesn't happen. Right. But, if we can do it in a more positive way, and then also if we set the increments small enough. So for example, like if for my son, like let's say doing a whole math worksheet was too overwhelming for him. Like in our homework time together, he has never done a math worksheet without having a meltdown or something. It would be too much of me to ask him in that moment, do your entire math worksheet and then earn this. I kind of need to think about where he's at. It might be like, do 3 problems and then earn this reward. And I might even have to have a conversation with his teacher, which by the way, I've done this before, to decrease the quantity, in preferring the quality of the work. And so saying this big whole math worksheet is too much for him. Can I reduce the number of problems he has to do? So just by doing that, he's less likely to have an outburst anyways.
So how do we relate this to the 1-year-old through the toddler? Because that's what I'm thinking that, the 1-year-old, the 18-month, the 2-year-old.
Yeah.
How they think, how is the parent working? Cause do they, they're not getting quarters and they don't really understand that. So how do we set up a reward system for that age?
Yep. So the 2 basic reward systems that come before that, like let's say a quarter system, or what, clinically we might call like a token economy if we want to sound fancy. The 2 type are actually the very simple, do this, then get this, or first then contingency, where you might have even like, pictures, right, of certain things. Like, you might have a picture of like, let's say picking up a few things, or if your kid hates brushing their teeth, or, whatever it is that young child like doesn't like to do, right? So first you do this, and then so you have a picture, let's say, of brushing teeth. Okay. And then the next picture is you reading them a book, right? Cause maybe that's the reward, so you show them, we're going to brush our teeth and then we get to read our book, right? Or you're going to go pee-pee in the potty, then you're going to get a candy, whatever. So that's like the first then, where there's a direct tie between the behavior and the reward. That's a reward system too. So that's kind of like where you start. And then the next phase up from that would be like a star-based system. And I used that with both of my kids when they were younger too, where, we might be working on, teaching them to do a few things by themselves, right? So maybe, putting their clothes in the hamper, and then, maybe putting their socks on, some of those like things that we're trying to teach them how to do. And each thing they do, they earn that star. And then you might have a picture of the program that they're going to get to watch as a reward. It doesn't have to be candy or things from the dollar store. It could just be like, time with you, or their favorite show, or whatnot. Like it can be very simple. And in fact, sometimes the more simple, the better. You don't want what I call like the Disneyland effect of like, do these things, get $1 million, because how are you going to compete with that next time?
And how are you going to sustain that?
You can't sustain that. Yeah. And so, actually it's interesting in the research, like those things, sound like they would be more effective, but they're not always. Sometimes the very simple things. I think the most important thing is that you have to be careful about things the kids already have access to, right? So like I have a story from when I was little. My mom was, doing some basic work with me for my articulation, the way that I would say my THs and S's. And she bought me this really cool Barbie. Okay. And I really wanted this Barbie, and it was super motivating for me. And so I would have to work with her for 10 minutes, and then I would get to play with this Barbie for an hour. And then she put the Barbie back up, and then I would get it the next time I would work with her. And it was super motivating. But then my grandma bought me the Barbie. I think it was my grandma.
So you're like, then why do I have to work with mom?
Exactly. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that the key is scarcity. So it doesn't have to be expensive. I mean, you could go to the dollar store, you could do some treats, or it could just be like, you only get to watch this program when you do this, or we only play this really special game when you do that, right? And so that's how you kind of create a sense of motivation, things that your kids are willing to work for. Because oftentimes, if we have a reward system that isn't working, the first thing I'm going to ask you to look at is whether or not what you're using actually motivates the kid. Because a lot of times that's where it breaks down.
Oh, that makes so much sense. We do both, and I hear my downfall in one of them. So the first time my son had to get a strep test, that was dramatic. And I promised him a Lego set. And ever since then, and he was getting strep a lot. And so ever since then, every time he has to get a strep test, it's a Lego set, and those add up. So I set myself up for failure by the Lego set. But on the other side, both my kids love playing Uno with my husband and I at night. And our thing is, after they brush their teeth, we get to play family Uno. And that is their motivation, because they love it. And it's so simple. It's just so easy.
And sometimes it's the simple things that work. But yet, if we just change it slightly, it breaks down. So I think about my sister used to babysit my kids. So for a while, she was living with us. She's about 7 years younger than me, and she had moved back from the East Coast, and she was living with us. And so one of the really cool arrangements of her living with us, and she would babysit our kids from time to time. And I mean, she still babysits our kids, but we had like a babysitter on a regular basis for a minute, and it was really nice. But one of the things that she did, which was really effective, is she would the kids like to watch, she'd have movie night with the kids. But then, if we've ever done this before, you have movie night or something like that, and then it's bedtime. Well, kids will move so slow, and they'll fight if they have to get their pajamas on and brush their teeth, do all their rituals after the movie. So what she would do is about when the movie had like a half hour left, she would pause the movie and say, "Oh, let's look what time it is. We have enough time to finish the movie, but you need to get ready for bed. So we make sure we have enough time." So she would strategize, a way to motivate to do that. And then instead of taking 20 minutes to get ready for bed, it only takes them 3,
Yep. Yes, I'm all about, actually, I'm going to jump to that. I had another question about tantrums. Yeah. We're going to get to that. So let me take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to ask a question about schedules. We'll be right back. Okay, so I'm going to get to my tantrum question after, because I'm sure there are many people that want to hear about tantrums. But let's talk about that schedule, because it makes so much sense about that pause. And then, because kids, oh my gosh, getting my kids to do anything, ever since they were toddlers to even now, like getting their shoes and socks on as if they've never heard they have to do this. So let's talk about general schedule and routine, just to make things move smoother. I found that routines work really well. So what kind of suggestion or structure do you suggest? Because at different age, from like newborn all the way up to grade school, I feel like structure and routine are helpful, but maybe I'm totally off. What are your thoughts on that?
No, totally. So first of all, let's talk about why structure is important. Here's the thing. When you're a young kid, there is very little in your life that you can control. Okay. And on top of that, it's hard for you to even realize what's going to be happening next and all of that. And that can be overwhelming. And so one way to kind of like, scheduling does a lot of things, but it reduces anxiety because it lets you know what's coming up next. Because if you and I had to live our life of like, we don't know what's happening in an hour at all, I don't know about you, but like that creates a lot of anxiety for me. Right? I'm a planning type of person. But so I think that's one reason why scheduling works. But also, it gives kids a sense of autonomy too, especially as they're getting older, rather than being over reliant on us as parents. One of the most important things we're doing is helping our kids become independent. And so schedules really help kids become independent. So I use schedules a lot, and you can use schedules with really young kids too. So I like that you mentioned that schedules and then also routines, because I think that for the really young ones, it's just a routine, right? So if they get to have a routine, and I'm not talking about something that has to be so rigid, right? I think sometimes as parents in the beginning, we become so rigid about nap time and all those things that sometimes we kind of miss out on certain things of life because we're too rigid. Okay. Mm-hmm. But I think overall, having a rhythm to the day, even for really young kids, even babies, is very helpful for you as the parent and for the kids. But even as young as toddlers, you can start to set up visual schedules. And, little kids can't read, but even if you say like in the morning, and you can, print it out on a piece of paper and find an icon, use Google, say, brush teeth or, whatever, you can just print that out and have the kids see. And then kind of point them back to look like, here, we're going to do this and this and this. And then pointing them back to that helps them again become more independent. Now, of course, for kids who are really young, you're just going to be showing them, they're basically getting the prerequisite skills to follow a schedule. You're going to help them do it. But at a pretty young age, kids can start to do some of those things independently. Like toddlers can start to follow like, okay, I need to do these 3 things on the picture, and follow those and do some of those things, even at a pretty young age. And then up through like my, and I'll pause for a moment. You can ask any specific question you want. But so one of the things I'm using schedules for right now is our morning routine. So going back to my son, he has ADHD. He takes Vyvanse in the morning. It's a stimulant medication, and it helps him a ton. So I know different people have different opinions about medication or not, but for my son, and he was involved in the decision making, and we just saw a drastic improvement for him like right away. So it was a very positive thing. We use the medication in conjunction with behavioral strategies. But the way the stimulant medication works is that it's out of your system the next day, mostly. And so you have to take it every day. And so for the first hour he wakes up, that's like a really hard time for him. And for my son with his ADHD, he struggles in a few different ways. So he's not inattentive. He's actually a pretty focused kid. He has more of like the hyperactivity, impulsivity, and the lack of emotional regulation. So in the morning, he has a hard time controlling himself. He's likely to get into arguments with his sister. He's likely to say inappropriate things. And then if I ask him to put the milk away, for example, he's likely to melt and say like, but why, And, and the interesting thing is, 11 o'clock Landon is much different. He's pretty compliant. And so that knowing that hour is really challenging for him. First off, he's 10. So I have that conversation with him. I say, I noticed that the mornings are a hard time for you. He's like, yeah. And I said, so we talk about that's probably one of the reasons why it's harder. So we came up with like a list of things he's supposed to do when he wakes up in the morning. So I he has a little pill box. And so I set the little pill box out. So he takes his medication. And then a lot of times ADHD medications hasn't really impacted him, but can be hard on your appetite. So, make sure he eats something. So he makes his own breakfast. So he makes breakfast. And then what he does, and by the way, we're homeschooling this year, so we're not going out to school. And so he reads for a half hour. Okay. So that's something he has to do anyways for school. So he gets his half hour of reading in, and then he gets his clothes on and he brushes his teeth. So it's all written down for him and he knows the order he has to do it in. And that is his morning routine. And that is how we get through the first hour of the morning. We also have a reward system set up because he was struggling a fair amount a few weeks back with that in the morning, not getting into arguments with his sister and doing a few things. And so we use a reward system, by the way, that he came up with, right? He's 10. So he's very it's a self-monitoring system. He came up with it. He tracks it himself. And then we kind of talk through it. So anyways, that's how I use scheduled with my 10-year-old, which is a lot different than a picture-based schedule I might use with a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old.
But what's interesting about that is I can imagine, because actually it's funny you talked about the schedule. Literally this morning, my husband and I wrote a schedule for my son. Pretty much the same thing.
Right.
But with both, whether they're 10 or 2, and if everything's accomplished, there is a sense of excitement and confidence. I did all the things I was supposed to and it went well. And that can, I imagine, lead to just adding to one's confidence and again, autonomy. Look what I accomplished. Look what I did. I'm so proud of myself. And then I can imagine that just keeps helping them wanting to repeat that. Oh, the next day I'm going to do that.
Yes.
Oh, look at me. I did all my things. Whether again, they're 10 or 2, it's just a sense of accomplishment.
And you can actually incorporate. So one of the things that is a proactive strategy to help, prevent problematic behavior from happening in the first place is providing a lot of choices as a, proactive approach. So, and by the way, you have to be careful to do it proactively. So if your child acts out and then you give them choices, then they're going to act out to get choices. So you don't want to do it in that order. Order matters. But if you give them choices and allow them to make some, decisions about what their schedule is going to look like, then you get their sense of buy-in and it goes usually so much smoother. Because again, little kids, they don't have very much choice in general about their day. So give them choices whenever possible so that they can have that sense of control, some control over their life,
Let's even talk about the choices because I was told don't give too many choices because it's overwhelming. So how many choices are you giving?
Yeah, I would. So it depends on development, the ages as well as, where your kiddo is at. So for example, you don't want to give a 3-year-old choices between 5 types of cereal, right?
Or I want it all.
They aren't going to know how to make that choice. They're going to have maybe a meltdown because it stresses them out. So you maybe want to give if you're talking about cereal, maybe you want to give a 2-year-old, do you want this for breakfast or this for breakfast? You don't want to give them 5 choices. When the kids are a little bit older, some of it is just the order of some of the activities. So, in the afternoons, my kids know what they need to accomplish before they can have screen time, but I let them choose the order of what they do those things in. So you have to do your piano, practice your piano, and you have to write out what you read about, and you have to clean your room, all those things, but you can choose the order you do them in.
That makes so much sense. Yes. Yeah. I wanted to get back to the tantrum question because I know that tantrums happen.
Yes.
We don't like them, but they happen.
No,
and I feel like they
happen.
I'm waiting for them to stop. So
I know, me too.
So from, a baby up to whenever they stop, what are some strategies and tactics? And again, I know it's going to be different. The way that you work with an older child is going to be different than a younger child, but what are some basic strategies and tips for handling tantrums? Or preventing tantrums.
Yeah. So a lot of what we've been talking about today so far already will help prevent a tantrum, right? So kids who have, a schedule, who have a reward system, all of those things, those are going to immediately reduce the number of tantrums that you have, in your home anyways. Now, tantrums can happen for a while. I think kind of going back to one of the things I spoke about earlier, my son struggles with the fact that he still has tantrums and his sister really doesn't. And he realizes that, and he's working on that. But he is pretty, in some ways, he's pretty mature. So it bothers him that he still sometimes can lose control in that way. So first of all, like if you're out there and your kiddo is still having tantrums, like and they're older, just know that that's like normal, but it's also normal. I remember, so my son was a late talker as well. And when he initially started having tantrums, it was a little scary actually, because he had a little bit of, as a clinician, what I would call like some self-injurious behavior, where he didn't have the words to tell me why he was frustrated. And so he would tantrum on the floor a little bit, and he a few times hit his head on the floor, like not hard enough that he was really hurt, but no parent wants to see that, right? So sometimes in those situations, especially with the really young ones, it can be tempting to overreact. So you're not going to just sit there and let a kid hurt himself. Obviously, you're going to like step in. Okay. But at the same time, if you're like, oh, no, why are you doing that? Like less is more. If you're talking and using a lot of words to talk to a child who's throwing a tantrum, they're not listening. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I'm really upset, if somebody tries to reason with me, I'm not always in the right mind to like be reasonable either. Right. And, here I am, so much older, right? Versus like, especially with little kids. So try not to talk to your kids like they're adults when they're having this meltdown, because it's not effective. And inadvertently, what's happening is you're giving a lot of attention to that problematic behavior. And it sounds weird, but any attention for kids sometimes is better than no attention, right? So, even though nobody wants to be like reprimanded or scolded or whatnot, you would think sometimes they would prefer that to nothing. And so you might start to see patterns where if you're like, oh, it's okay, or the opposite of like, stop doing that, you'll start to see higher rates of that tantrum behavior. And so what I would say is when little kids are having a tantrum, first of all, you want to make sure they're safe, right? Mm-hmm. And so like with my son, I just put my hand out. So I wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to actually hurt himself. But I just kind of waited for that opportunity where he calmed down a little bit. And then I tried to redirect him, right? To do something else. And by the way, it kind of depends as well, like why the tantrum is happening. Okay. So most behavior happens, we are communicative beings. We're telling what we want with our words when we're older, but then especially when we're younger, all we can do is act in certain ways to try to communicate what we want. And so either your kids are trying to tell you that they want something or they want to get out of something. Okay. And so you kind of want to look in the situation and say like, why is my child acting the way that they're acting? If they're trying to get something, is it that they can't have that thing, or is it that they're asking inappropriately, right? And so you want to come up with ways for them to ask appropriately. If they don't have words, it's pointing or taking you over to what they want. Mm-hmm. And as they're older, it's learning how to very simply ask for what they want with words. So that's the first step. Do they know how to ask for what they want? And then are you more likely to respond to their tantrum or them politely asking you? Because sometimes we're so busy in what we're doing, we react to their tantrum. We kind of put them off if they ask appropriately. Versus on the flip side, if they're acting out or having a tantrum to get out of something, we have to be careful too. So if we let them, like, let's say they're having a tantrum because they don't want to brush their teeth, right? If we say, oh, it's okay, and we console them and whatnot, and they get to delay brushing their teeth, then sometimes what you might start to see is kind of that pattern emerging, mm-hmm. where whenever it's time to brush my teeth, I have a tantrum because it worked before, right? It delayed and I got some attention and I got a delay in what I didn't want to do. So that's when, again, so in the moment, in terms of what you should do and not do, try to not draw a lot of attention to it. Kind of, wait it out in a safe way. Try to redirect them back to the task. If they're trying to get out of something, try to redirect them to how to ask appropriately. If they want something, that sort of thing. But then you step back and you think about like, what can I do proactively to prevent that tantrum in the future, right? And so if it's brushing teeth, it could be like setting up a reward system for, brushing teeth without having a tantrum, right? Or if it's, one of the things that people talk about a lot with toddlers is getting up in the middle of the night too many times and having, and then parents struggle all the time with that, of like kids not wanting to sleep in their own bed if they want them to sleep in that bed, or, not wanting to go to sleep. And you might do something even creative. You might come up with like a ticket system, for example, where like, let's say your kiddo like gets up on average like 3 times in the night, right? So you could create tickets and you could have them color the tickets, and you can kind of get their buy-in on that, for the toddlers. I'm not talking about the babies. I'm talking about the toddlers, right? Who have a little bit of language and have some understanding. And every time they go out, they have to give you a ticket. Okay. And once they run out of tickets, they can't come back out. And then in the morning, if they, didn't come back out without tickets, then they earned a star in their chart and they can earn something. So that would be an example
really
of like
cute.
Yeah.
I have to admit, we dodged that bullet. My kids never tried to come into our bed. As you were saying, like 3 times a night. Oh my goodness. It's
pretty common.
I hear it is common. I'm just feeling very grateful that that's not one of our many issues that we embarked on, because sleep, when I'm without sleep, it's very ugly. So,
totally. I'm not a nice person when I haven't had enough sleep.
Yeah, ask my husband. I'm not. Lack of food and lack of sleep. It's ugly. I wanted to come back to something. You've talked about it a bunch. I want to dive into it a little bit more. You talk about reactive versus proactive. Can you tear that apart a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think that we should spend about 80% of our energy on the proactive side. And I'll kind of define that again in a second. And, maybe only 80% of our time on the reactive side. And what I mean by that is proactively, what are the things that we're doing to prevent that challenging behavior from happening? So that's so many different things. That's like structure and schedules, maybe use of timers. I use timers a lot.
Timers are big. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, my kids both have watches. And so I use that a lot, set a timer for 10 more minutes and then X, right? Or on their iPads, because they have iPads, I set screen time limits on their iPads, and then that's a timer for them. Again, it gives them some of that autonomy, and then it's like the timer's fault and not my fault that their screen time is done. So going back, so the reward system, it's, trying to prime them and tell them when it's going to be time to transition. It's, making sure that they're not doing too many things that are hard. You want to have kind of a mixture of, if you're always working at the edge of your ability, that's going to be hard. So, like kids who struggle in classrooms, like you can see why academics and behavior are tied, because like if you're constantly doing things that are hard, you're going to be likely to act out. So trying to make sure that they have enough things that they're successful doing during their day. You wouldn't want to teach them how to clean their room and how to brush their hair and how to make their lunch all at the same time. That's going to feel overwhelming. So making sure that we're teaching some things, but they get to do a lot of things where they already know how to do those things. All of those things, it's like, how can I set up the day so that my child in this setting is less likely to have problematic behavior? So that's like the proactive side. And then on the reactive side, it's like, how should I respond when problematic behavior occurs? So no matter what we do as parents, our kids are going to act out from time to time. How do I respond? Okay, so I might have a timeout system that I use. You go for X amount of minutes to a certain location, or I take certain thing away for a certain period of time. Or for older kids, there might be a loss of a privilege, right? For a certain period of time. Or, I might have to have a conversation with my kids about why certain behavior is not acceptable, right? And what are the long-term, like as kids are getting older, right? So that's the how I'm dealing with the problematic behavior. But what ends up happening is that if we're not careful, it's actually the other way around, where we spend 80% of our time on discipline, right, on that reactive side, and 20% on the proactive side. And we can't feel like we're catching up, and we're still working really, really hard, except the vibe in our home is negative, right? And so by focusing on the proactive or the preventative side, we have a much happier home with less problematic behavior. And it sounds like it takes more effort initially. So you definitely have to plan these things takes a little bit of effort on the front side. But once those things are working, then it's actually a lot easier.
Yes, we've done a lot of that. That it took us, I would say our whole summer was very reactive. And then when we sat down, my husband and I sat down and really talked about schedules and reward system, which we've done for years, but it really came to a head. Could be because we were in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes.
And school was kind of a hot mess at the end of the year. But when we really sat down and ironed out a reward system and routine and just really looked at how can we support during this uncertainty, it definitely we saw a trend that things got better in behavior. Yeah. And that kind of leads me to one of my last questions is parenting right now. I mean, it's just, there's so much insecurity and unknown, and it's hard. I think it's hard on the kids, that anxiety. Cause I remember like my daughter would say like, when the illness is over, when the virus is gone, I'm like,
Yeah.
So how can parents create an environment of feeling safe and secure when there's just no answers?
Yeah. I mean, I think that first of all, we're overwhelmed. And so when we're as parents overwhelmed, it's going to be overwhelming for our kids too. So I think like we have to give ourselves some grace in that, like life is not normal right now. So if your kids are struggling a little bit, guess what? That's most of kids right now. And, it's a little bit of grief in the sense of like, what could have been or what used to be. And there is a sense of loss. I think it's not that everything is all bad. I mean, I do feel closer to my kids than I ever have before. I spend a lot more time with them. That's for sure.
All the time.
You're right. But I think it's just a sense that like, it's okay that we're going through if your kids are struggling, I think that that's a very normal thing. Whether they're struggling academically, guess what? Most kids are. If they're struggling social emotionally, guess what? Most kids are. And so kind of realizing that it's a hard time and having a level of like acceptance about that. I think we have to also be mindful of our conversations in front of our kids, and what we're watching and what we're talking about, because they're listening to everything we say from a very young age. And so we just need to be mindful of, what we're saying and how we're saying it, but we don't want to shy away from the conversations either. So even if your child is in, preschool, having conversations about, what's going on in a developmentally appropriate way and talking about, there are people who are getting sick and we're being careful about that, but like still having, I mean, sometimes it feels like we just talk about this a lot, but our kids need that conversation consistently a little, to a certain extent. That isn't necessarily, one of catastrophe, but just like the ongoing conversation about the current situation. Right. But then also there is just less that can be expected and accomplished right now. You can't expect to live like you used to. Right. I mean, on the one hand, this is going to go on for a while. We need to make the best of it and do our best for sure. Mm-hmm. But you also kind of have to accept that things right now are challenging. And, in the current context, it's just, we can't expect the same things as we would expect from before. And so set yourself up for success and don't necessarily ask as much of your kids as you would have in a different situation. Like it sounds silly, but like think about this. Like I talk to parents who have kids who are sick, not necessarily with like COVID, but just sick kids in general. It's hard to know how to parent sick kids because when our kids are sick, we feel bad. We want to, obviously we should comfort them, make sure that they're doing okay and all of that. Nobody likes to be sick and we don't like to see our kids sick. However, so the best thing to do in that certain circumstance though, is to ask a little bit less of your kids, but still follow through on what you do ask of them. Right. And, so try not to ask things that are above and beyond what you should, and then kind of follow through with what you do ask them. So don't let it become like too much of a crutch per se, but at the same time, if you ask your kid, even when your kids are sick, if you ask them to do something, if at all possible, follow through, right? And just kind of create that. But there are no easy answers right now. I don't have anything magical to say. I think there are certain things that you could probably do now with your kids that you will not be able to do later on when things do hopefully level out a bit, so take advantage of those moments if you can. And, just give yourself a little bit of grace.
I do like your suggestion about being mindful of what you say in front of them. I realize that we always listen to NPR or the Daily podcast in the morning. And I realized at one point my son was like, enough with the COVID. And I'm like, oh, it was starting to get him anxious. So we had to be super mindful that we still wanted to be aware of what's going on in our world, but maybe first thing in the morning was not the time to do that. And I can imagine even young kids that don't quite have the articulation of understanding what's going on, they can still sense, from tones of voices and how parents are reacting, anxiety coming off the parent.
Think about this. If your animals and pets can pick up on your anxiety, which they can, how much more can, your kids, right? Even babies, if you're, super stressed out and whatnot, not to say you should feel bad about it, but just be cognizant of it, right? About what we say and how we act in front of our kids.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to take one more break. When we come back, if you can offer one final tip or piece of advice you'd like to give to new or expectant parents, we'll be right back. Okay, so I know you have a lot as a professional, a lot as a parent in your brain and your whole toolkit. What would you like to offer for our new and expectant parents?
Yeah, so I think that kind of my emphasis is always that reward system. And I actually have a free resource that your listeners can download. So if you go to my website is Prism Behavior, PRISM behavior.com/free guide, it'll actually walk your listeners through 3 different types of reward systems to use based upon age, right? So from that, younger, where you're going to use, like I spoke about, that first then, to kids who are a little bit older that you can use the star chart, to kids who are even older that you might use a quarter-based system. So it's just the basics of how you do that. And I think that is the implementing that and using that. It changes your kids' behavior, but also it changes your behavior. At least I find it for myself. It keeps me in check because, I know about these things, right? That doesn't mean I always do them because I'm a human and I get frustrated. And actually the thing I struggle with is yelling. It sounds like I shouldn't have that issue, but I do. I'm a very forgiving person. I get over things really fast, but I run hot. That's just how I am.
You and I are so similar. People you're a yeller, you're a yoga teacher. I'm like, oh, but I'm a yelling yoga teacher. And I'm in the same way. I will forgive and kind of move on. But thank you for saying that because I feel slightly validated now.
Yes. And I think that,
not that it's good, but it is the reality.
But we're human and I mess up on a daily basis, whether it's with my kids or with my husband or whatnot. You are not perfect. I am not perfect and it's okay. And it's once we can accept that, then I think we can move forward. Yeah. And so having a reward system, it forces me as the parent to focus on the positive, right? And in terms of what my kids are doing right, instead of harping on the negative. And honestly, what works today isn't going to work tomorrow, right? The context is always changing. So I'm always having to reinvent
tweak your
our reward system and tweak it. And as my kids get older and older, they have more to say about it in terms of what they want to work for and whatnot. And it's really cool to see that buy-in. There's a lot of research on self-monitoring, right? In terms of creating that long-lasting behavior change. self-monitoring is really important. And so as my son, I can start to see it in him as he learns to control his own behavior and tracks his own behavior. It's really rewarding for him to see his own success. Right?
Yeah.
And so I guess that's the thing I would recommend. Is start small. Try to, if you find that you're overly reliant on discipline, don't feel bad about it, but try to come up with a way to flip the negative to the positive. Use a reward system, because if anything, it'll help you as the parent. Because really, I'm the one who's reacting to the behavior, right? And I know from my background that the situation we're in impacts us a lot. And I am a big part of my kids' situation, right? So it's not to say it's my fault if they act out, but I still have a big influence, in on it. And I want to have that influence, because as my kids get older and older, their friends take over that influence, right? And so I want to take advantage of this time right now with them and kind of, teach them right from wrong, but in such a way that is positive. So that's what I would recommend. You go to prismbehavior.com/free guide.
And I'll make sure I have that in our show notes. Yeah.
Awesome.
And then where can people find your work?
Yeah. So, besides my website, I have a podcast as well. So I've been doing it for about 2 years. I have recently shifted to a seasons format. So I see you've been doing yours for a long time. So I'd be curious, about, things that you do to keep it fresh and whatnot. Because after 2 years, I realized that I needed a short break. So I took I was like, I think I'm going to, I still love to do it, and I'm still committed. And by the way, I've been doing a bunch of interviews, and it's going to be launching again into its second season in just a few weeks. But yeah, I kind of realized that I wanted to work in seasons, and whatnot. But anyways, it's called Prism Parenting.
I can't wait to listen to more. I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts. I'm excited for season 2. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with me and really pouring so much information and such heart into this conversation. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
This has been an episode of Yoga Birth Babies, produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. You can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Periscope. I'm Deb Flaschenberg. Thanks for listening.